Hi, I'm Mark Forsythe, and I'm here for the BC Historical Federation at the brand new Chinese Canadian Museum in Chinatown. It hasn't actually opened yet, so we're getting a preview of this incredible exhibit that Catherine Clement has been working on for the last 4 years. And Catherine, thanks for being here for our discussion and chat. And maybe you could give us a sense of the genesis for this exhibit that you've been working on.
It was many years ago, about 14 years ago, when I volunteered for a project to interview the last of the remaining World War II veterans. And I put up my hand, I said, I'm in Vancouver, and they said, oh, well, we'll assign you to a Chinese Canadian. Now, I'm half Chinese, but I grew up primarily white, and so knew very little about my Asian history. And I remember walking in to do this interview with this aging Chinese Canadian World War II veteran, and it completely changed my life. It began like this love of history and for these stories that have been lost, and it went from there. But actually the genesis of this exhibition was when I would interview those World War II veterans, because then it became another one and another one. And I would say, well, can you show me your photos? And they would bring out their photos or shoe bags or whatever, shoe boxes. And I began to see these little tiny cards, and they had an insignia on it that said CI5. It was a picture of them as a child. Most of them were issued in 1924. And emblazoned across the top was this Department of Immigration and Colonization. And at the bottom was, this certificate does not establish legal status in Canada. But he had just told me he was born in Vancouver, or the other one in Cumberland or Nanaimo. And I would say, well, what's this? Why do you have an immigration card? And there was sort of a little bit of conversation, and we'd go on to something else. But the genesis of this exhibition actually begins with those interviews and noticing this pattern. And about 4 years ago, I was just finishing up another community story, and I realized the anniversary's coming. I'm not hearing anybody talk about anything. I know that there are hundreds of these documents out there, which are evidence of the Exclusion Act, but they're very, very few in public archives. A smattering in Library and Archives Canada, a smattering at UBC, maybe 12 to 15. So where are the rest? And so that began this journey to crowdsource as many of these certificates as I can. It's so, there's an irony here, though, that the very thing that Chinese, they were excessively documented more than any other migrant group. Even Library and Archives Canada said that. The head of Library and Archives Canada once said, no other group of individuals was ever as heavily documented as the Chinese. And these very things that we hate, the very things that actually got ripped up eventually as Chinese got citizenship, are what's left to take us back into this story of the Exclusion Act. They're the paper trail, thus the title of the show. They lead us back because our community just generally didn't talk about it. One generation never talked about this with the next.
What was happening 100 years ago to make these certificates necessary as far as the Canadian government was concerned?
Well, it's interesting that to have exclusion in Canada required excessive documentation. And in the intro to the show, we talk about oceans of ink and reams of paper, and armies of bureaucrats had to be deployed in order to exclude a particular group. And part of it was around control and surveillance and monitoring intimidation. These pieces of paper were worth gold.
You had to carry it, didn't you?
Yeah, many people had to carry it. We find some of them in the exhibition that are so dog-eared and worn and torn apart because some fellow had to carry them with him every day in his back pocket.
And if he didn't have it with him, what was the consequence, potentially?
Well, probably he would have to go and get it.
Right.
Or you might get deported if you couldn't prove who you were.
Or pay a fine.
Or pay a fine. But a lot of that happens before exclusion. So in fact, I mean, what we're trying to talk about in this exhibition is that the Exclusion Act was actually not the beginning of exclusion. The first step in exclusion was the first head tax, because it was designed, it happened right after the railway was completed. We have all these Chinese laborers who helped build the railway through British Columbia. The government, well, we don't want them to stay, and we certainly don't want them to bring their wives over, so we'll introduce a head tax. And that was the first step in exclusion. And then it went up to $100, then $500.
$500 eventually.
And then the First World War, at the end of the First World War, the government was worried about the returning white soldiers. So exclusion expands, and they begin to say no Chinese laborers can come in anymore. And eventually they change the age at which children can come in.
Close the door.
Yes.
Essentially.
And then exclusion is where it's so narrow, it's hard to get through. But it also has this other part of it, which was this registration drive. And this results in a whole bunch of other new papers and documents, which we have discovered and partly display in this exhibition.
So Catherine, we're standing beside CI5 Certificate. What does that represent, CI5?
So CI means Chinese immigration, and 5 is a name of a particular type of certificate. There were CI5, CI4, CI44s, CI36s, CI28s, CI30s, it goes on, CI50s, CI45s. This is, every time something came up, the government created a new kind of document to monitor and control.
A new category,
Chinese.
Essentially, or?
Yeah, they each meant something else. But these ones are, there's two things about these. This is an actual head tax certificate. This fellow came in 1912, and we see his photograph here.
And it says where he came from as well.
Where he came from, yeah, what date he arrived. And what's interesting here is, and again, this is part of the Chinese-Canadian story, is that the first mass use of photo identification was for the Chinese.
$500. How significant is that in 1923 or 24?
Well, $500, actually, it was started, I think, in 1902 is when they first introduced that. And at that time, it was equivalent to about 2 years' worth of wages at that time. So here we have CI5s. These are all in order in which they were issued to, all coming from families across Canada, and then into CI30s, which were people who were exempt. And here's where you start to see women and children. This is the merchant class who are bringing in their families. And then other ones on the other panels, which are various types of replacement certificates. These are going to be part of the archive. And it's actually, I have the BC Historical Federation to thank, because when this was just an idea about 4 years ago, I applied for a grant, and they gave me my first grant. It was $4,000 to begin the work of collecting these, finding them, scanning them at really ultra-high resolution, collecting the stories. So the Federation was I'm so grateful. It may not have happened had I not had that seed money.
Yeah, that's wonderful to hear. It's the power of our Centennial Legacy Fund that we encourage people to contribute to as well, so that research like this, basically untold stories in BC's history, find the light of day. Yes. I'm just glancing up on the wall here. Chinese Humiliation Day on July 1st. That was Dominion Day, now Canada Day. But what did that signify, July 1st, 1924?
Well, and this is what was interesting. A lot of Chinese that know the Exclusion Act think that it was July 1st, 1923, which was Humiliation Day, but it wasn't. So when the Act comes in, and symbolically the government chooses July 1st, Canada Day, to make the Act official. The Act was, one part was exclusion, and the other part was this mass mandatory registration. And interestingly, it wasn't the exclusion that bothered the community the most. It was actually the registration that scared them. What would it mean? Like, Many would have had memories of being interrogated when they first tried to get into the country. There was fear, like, what if we don't remember things the way the government has them recorded? What if I'm a paper son? What if I came in as a merchant? I didn't pay the head tax, but my business failed. Businesses fail all the time. But what happened was, so June 30th, 1924 was the deadline for registration. And the very next Canada Day, the community dubbed it Humiliation Day. And it became a day of mourning for a long time, where people would lower the flag to half-mast, and people put in mourning wreaths into their windows. And I think if you think about it, the other headline over there is from 1922, November 1922, from the Victoria Daily Times, and it says, "Must bar Oriental completely to save the BC for the white race." But in the body copy, it says total exclusion of Chinese, Japanese, South Asian. So initially, the government was going to sweep all Asians, broadly speaking, into this barrel. But in the end, they only chose Chinese. And there was a feeling in the community that why us, right? Why do you have an immigration law for everybody else all over the world and a different one for us? This is an interesting story that comes from Windsor, Ontario. And here we see the mother holding the baby, because as part of the registration, you had to bring in 3 photos of yourself. And the government didn't know how do we register the Canadian-born children, because they don't have a CI5 or a CI30 or a 36, blah, blah, blah. So they invented this new card just for the registration. And this is where it says here, Department of Immigration and Colonization. This certificate does not establish legal status in Canada. And so these became in like a symbolic way to transfer exclusion to a new generation. One veteran said to me, there's dozens of ways they could have registered us native-born kids, but they chose to give us this card with that little tagline on it. And in this case, so here's Benny Lee. He's born in Windsor, Ontario, and his family told us the story about him. He and actually 2 of his other brothers, so of the 4 Lee brothers, 3 of them served in the war. And he came out, and the war was over, and he went back to his life in Windsor, and he ran a little kind of restaurant and everything. But when he was dying, he started to talk a little bit about the war. Didn't mention much about it, but just something about being really injured and being cut off from the rest of his group. And then his daughter said, once he passed away, Benny, the mother said, do you know your father had nightmares almost every night since he served in the war? And it was all these memories of something he had gone through. So he didn't die in the war, but he was impacted by the war, and he served his country despite the fact that he was given this, he and his brothers had this immigration card.
And this wasn't removed until after the war, was it? That it was 1947 that Canada finally realized it was time to end this.
Yes. They did 2 things in 1947. They repealed the Exclusion Act, and they brought in a Citizenship Act, which allowed Chinese Canadians to finally be called Chinese Canadians. But interesting, there's a story over on that newspaper board, which is the first group of Chinese Canadians to go up and stand and get their little citizenship certificate were veterans here in the Commodore Ballroom in Vancouver. And the story, though, for the reporter says they were showing allegiance to their adopted country. And yet every single one of them had been born here. So it's interesting, the mentality, right?
Absolutely.
You're Asian, therefore this is your adopted country.
You were saying this man is very handsome. You're right. This is Ernie Chan. Tell us about Ernie.
Well, Ernie is remarkable, and he's on a wall which we call our plum blossom wall. In Chinese culture, the plum blossom is the one flower. It flowers early and it flowers in winter and survives the harsh cold of winter. So it's a flower that represents perseverance, endurance, strength. And so these stories on this one wall are about those kinds of people. It didn't mean they didn't suffer. It didn't mean the act, the act did affect them, but they still were resilient enough to overcome. But he's also special because during the years of exclusion, which was almost a quarter century, there were only 44 individuals allowed in during that time. And Ernie was one of them. And he comes in
Why would he be allowed and the others not?
Some missionaries sponsored him who are in China. That's the thing about the act. There was the act, and then how the act is implemented on the ground by immigration officers, and you see some discrepancies there. So he is sponsored by some missionaries to come. They spot a really young, talented man. He ends up in Saskatchewan, and he works first at his brother's fruit stand, and then he winds up being trained as a teacher. So he becomes a teacher in engineering. He becomes like this model citizen. And in the end of his life, he actually gets the Order of Canada. Maybe Ernie really realized how remarkable of an opportunity he had, that he was one of these chosen people. And that in some ways, this kind of like completely giving his life to community and to students was a way that he kind of dealt with whatever he felt about being one of the few to come in, that kind of gratitude. He might have never gotten in otherwise, but it's like he makes up for whatever that privilege that he feels for having been allowed, one of those 44 allowed in.
Yes.
Yeah. So I wanted to do something here about that sense of time, that sense of being locked away, isolated, just.
And how did the community respond to that request? Do you know what happened on July 1st?
We don't actually. And what we found even on July 1st, 1924, is that the response really varies across the country. You have Victoria, really activist. They organize stuff and talks at a parade and, a morning parade. And then you have Montreal, Chinatown saying, we don't want to lower the flag to half-mast. We don't want to insult other Canadians by lowering the flag on such an important day for other Canadians. So it's really mixed.
The ratio of men to women in this period was 28-1. Obviously, lots of bachelors here and right across Canada. And you've created this Bachelors Alley. And what's the focus that you're bringing to this?
Well, first of all, we know of bachelors, and people talk about bachelors and have memories of bachelors, but we often don't know their names. There's no one to remember their stories and what they did. And I really wanted to shine a light onto them, to actually give some of them names, to find some stories about them. We also chose the alleyway because in many ways it symbolizes what their lives were like. They were cut off, they were separated, confined, often living in rooming houses in rooms with 8 other guys. And what's really interesting is that when the Exclusion Act goes in, and we have this 1 year where everyone is to register, we started to find these articles of these men committing suicide. So one after another, like in different places, taking their lives, becoming unhinged in other ways.
It's very stark. Suicide of Chinaman. Chinaman was tired of life.
Body of Chinaman is found hanging in the back of a restaurant, right? And some of these men had been here for years, but
so they had no hope of having a companion.
I think exclusion for some of these men, that was the last straw.
Yeah.
And we find also some of them getting committed to Essendale Hospital, which at that time was an insane asylum. They start coming in around, well, many came in before, but then you see some coming in just around the time of exclusion. It's like, I can't do it anymore, right? At least with the head tax, there was some glimmer of hope. Maybe if you won a good gambling hand and you made some money, you might be able to, reunite with your family here. But exclusion really kind of exasperated their isolation. So these are, I wanted to make books for 3 stories. They each illustrate something very different about a bachelor's life. And these are real men, and these are people that we found again. And this story of this fellow named Quan Moy was probably the one that affected me the most and changed how I was going to do this show. Before, I was doing the show that you see in the other room, which was, tell me your story of your ancestor. I'm going to tell it in the exhibition. It was Quan Moy that made me realize of all these voices that have gone silent. And we found his story in a little article in July of 1924. And it's a story of, he's a cook. He's been here for over 20 years. By the time the Exclusion Act happens, he's out of work. He's not well. He's lost his, his source of income. And he is falling into a deep depression. And he takes his life shortly after the end of the registration period. He registers. And as a result, from this little newspaper article, I could find his registration in those recently unlocked files. And I could find a picture of him. And here he was. And I look at him and I just think, he's looking, this is months before he takes his life, just a few months. So even though he was so depressed, he dutifully registered. He had no money, but he had to shirt and tie, and he had to pay for the photographer, even though he was destitute. And he's got a stiff collar, and but he's very somber looking. Like there's something haunting about his look. And 5 months later, it's interesting. We found in the story, in the newspaper, he had a watch on, and he had his CI5 certificate in his pocket, and that was it basically. And he hung himself. And he was discovered the next morning. And, we'll never know how much the Exclusion Act played a role in this, but it seems to all fall around the same time. He's buried in Mountain View. And there he lies in an unmarked grave and kind of, separated in death as he was in life. And I thought 100 years later, we should tell his story. He deserves it. Mm-hmm. Makes me cry. These things make me cry.
Yes. Understandably, but it's such a powerful exhibit on so many different levels. And thank you so much for sharing your passion for this project and the stories of the people that you discovered. And we encourage people to come and visit at the new Chinese Canadian Museum on East Pender in Chinatown. And also these, all of these certificates are going to be part of the Vancouver City Archives, I believe.
No, UBC.
UBC Archives.
UBC Archives,
pardon me.
yes.
So there's a digital version.
Yes.
And the Government of Canada is opening up its archives to share more material as well.
All the registration forms that we've been talking about as part of exclusion will also be finally available online, digital format. So it's like a treasure trove of material that will help other people find their own paper trail.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you.